So I'm going to begin us with talking about what is spirituality and how is it related to therapy. Just to give you a little bit about my background, I have an MSW from Pitt. I'm not licensed, but I also have a PhD in formative spirituality from Duquesne. It was a program that not only was training in spiritual direction, but since the program at Duquesne came out of its psychology department, it actually was focused initially on how do we integrate psychology and counseling with spirituality. It started in 1962 at Duquesne. There's a person I'm going to mention a number of times. His name is Adrian von Kamm, who was the one who started it. He was brought over from the Netherlands in the late 1950s to help Duquesne develop its existential and phenomenological psychology program. And it was out of the frustrations of that he recognized that counseling and psychology deals very well with the psychological, but there's another dimension that we're missing. And he basically believed, because of his own experiences, that if you don't integrate that other dimension, you're not bringing in the full level of healing. He developed his ideas during World War II as a seminary student in the Netherlands. When the Nazis took over, he was part of the Dutch resistance and was asking the question, we're basically hiding Jews, Catholics, Protestants, and atheists, and we're keeping them alive and we're keeping them relatively safe. But how do we deal with all the dimensions of their lives? Because we're isolating them. We're isolating them from other people. We're isolating them from their family. And so they began to ask, how do we help them physically? How do we help them mentally? How do we help them relationally? And how do we help them spiritually? And out of that, he began to develop ideas as part of the Dutch resistance on how do we help people who are under occupation. After the war, he developed, yeah, Carla, you don't have a choice, you're going to have to come up front. After the war, he began to develop what are called life schools, which were schools in Holland that were about developing people, and then came over here to the US and began to develop theories on integrating spirituality into therapy. So I'm going to be bringing in a lot of different perspectives. But as I bring in different perspectives, you're going to find certain parts, especially in the third one, I believe, where I'm really going to rely heavily on a lot of his theories. So the big thing to recognize is no matter what we do, spirituality is hard to define for a number of reasons. Number one, it's not empirically available to study. It's a quality, not so much a quantity. And all of us have been nurtured and cultivated in counseling programs that have tried as much as possible to be empirically based. It's one of the reasons why cognitive behavioral therapy is pretty much now the standard therapy that everyone's taught in their master's program, because it is the one kind of therapy that is the easiest to test. It's the easiest to operationally define. It's the easiest to figure out whether it's successful or not, because you can break it down into components. Spirituality is different because spirituality is experienced differently by different people, depending on what level of spiritual awareness or non-awareness there are. Different religions describe it differently, or in most cases, they don't even describe spirituality at all. It's just a part of what they do. It is experiential, and different people experience the spiritual differently. Experiences are also, and this is something that I think I want to implant in your mind right now because it's an important component that I'm going to bring out later. Experiences, spiritual experiences, are highly dependent on beliefs and expectations, but also can defy beliefs and expectations. Why am I saying that that's so important? Because we're trying so hard to disconnect spirituality from religions, which means we're trying to create a spirituality that is not based on beliefs. And yet, your beliefs shape your spirituality. If you believe there is a God, then that's going to shape your spirituality. If you believe there is no God, that's going to shape you spiritually. If you believe there is no God, but there is a mystical universe, that will shape your experiences. If you believe in the Force and spend a lot of times trying to get a speeder out of a swamp, that will shape your spirituality. Your beliefs and expectations have a lot to do with your spirituality, and that's true for your clients also. Your clients have beliefs and expectations, and they may not be the same as yours. A lot of times in counseling, what people are trying to do is to create non-religious spirituality while working with religious people. And the problem is, what's happened in a lot of therapy is we've created kind of a therapeutic approach spiritually that I might call Buddhism light, where mindfulness and meditation are the main things. But you're really setting up a belief and expectation which is really narrowing it. Alternatively, you can get Christian counseling centers that have expectations and beliefs where they're really biblically based, but then they don't really allow for a spirituality that does not fit their interpretation of the Bible. Does that make sense of what I'm saying? By the way, with both what Susan and I are doing, you don't ever have to agree with us. My question is always, does what I'm saying make sense? You can do with it what you want. The final thing is spirituality transcends rational knowing. And for people who want everything to be rational, a lot of times spirituality is not rational. My whole career has never made rational sense. It doesn't necessarily mean that, actually my coming to Samaritan did not make rational sense, but it was what I felt called to do. So, I'm going to start, because it's always helpful in things like this, I'm going to start with a video about what spirituality is. This is a video that I think captures it the best. It's a life insurance commercial from Thailand.
เขาจะได้อะไรถ้าเขาทำแบบนี้ทุกวันเขาจะไม่ได้อะไรเลยไม่ได้รวยขึ้นไม่ได้ออกทีวีไม่มีใครรู้จักไม่ได้มีชื่อเสียงที่มากขึ้นเพราะสิ่งที่เขาได้คือได้แค่ความรู้สึกได้เห็นความสุขได้เข้าใจได้ความรักได้ในสิ่งที่เงินซื้อไม่ได้ได้โลกที่สวยงามกว่าเดิมในชีวิตคุณอะไรคือสิ่งที่คุณต้องการมากที่สุด
ยประกันชีวิตเชื่อในความดี
So without going into long definitions, what stood out as spiritual qualities in this?
I think one thing is the person was really pulled out of himself.
The person's pulled out of himself. Yeah, what else? Is that a part you know?
Yes.
Okay, good.
It seemed like even when he didn't see the results quickly, it didn't deter him from continuing.
Yeah, it's not always results-based. Spirituality isn't always results-based. What else? Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
He did everything that he did without worrying what other people.
Yeah, in other words, he moved out of worrying about what others thought and was just living out of something beyond. Yeah, what else? Go ahead, Mark.
It's relational.
Yeah, everything's relations. Not just with people, but with plants and dogs too. Linda.
He ignored cultural norms and went with his heart.
Yeah, he ignored cultural norms and everybody's shaking their head. What else?
He was life-giving.
He was life-giving. What else?
Expansive rather than narrow.
Yeah, it's expansive rather than narrow. So as you look at this, what would be a definition of spirituality? I'll let you kind of think through that for yourself. This is a question I'll leave with you to do on your own because I don't think we have enough time to just get everybody's perspective on what spirituality is. Well, I don't know. Actually, based on this, maybe what would you say the definition of spirituality is?
Connection of spirits.
What?
The connection of spirits.
The connection of spirits. What else? Go ahead, Carla.
Following the inner voice that comes from somewhere.
Yeah, following an inner voice that comes from somewhere. What else?
I think an openness to being wherever you are and taking on whatever comes across your
Yeah,
path.
an openness to being where you are and whatever's coming your way. What else?
I see it as a transcendent way of knowing.
It's a transcendent way of knowing. Any others?
Recognizing that there's more to life than
Yeah.
just, me taking care of me.
Yeah, there's more to life than just me taking care of me. One of the problems has been this definition of spirituality. And one of the reasons why is you're talking about a realm that doesn't have a language. If you're going to use the brain, talk about the brain, it's more a right brain understanding than a left brain. The right brain, which is more expansive, metaphorical understanding of symbols and captures big picture. Left brain is detailed, specific. It's more language-based. I don't know if you know this. How many of you are right-handed? Do you know, actually, your left brain controls your right hand, which is the precision one. How many of you are left-handed? Actually, you have the same thing. Is actually what brain researchers have found is in you, your brains are just flipped. The typical left side's on your right side, and the typical right side is on your left side, but you still have those two hemispheres of the brain. So looking at this, what I would do is I'm going to kind of give you my definition. It doesn't mean you have to stay with this. But in my experience, it's the connection with something beyond ourselves. This is where language fails. When I was studying at Duquesne, they used to call God the mystery of formation, which is a very clunky word, but it's trying to understand this idea that the divine God, whatever you want to call it, is a mystery that's always forming us. Others, Catherine Marshall, who was a charismatic, she was a Holy Spirit-oriented writer in the 60s, 70s, early 80s. She just called it something more. Different languages. Islam, Allah. In Buddhism, it's more universe. In some, it's divided into gods so that the different qualities can be kind of expressed. But ultimately, what I've come up with is, and this will change next time I have to come up with a definition for spirituality, so I've redefined it at least 150 times over my life. It's just a connection with something beyond ourselves that offers wisdom, purpose, meaning. I added a few to what you have down below you. Unity, love, transcendence. But the key thing is it transforms us. What did you notice was taking place in that commercial? Transformation. Spirituality, when it is connected with, is always transforming. Always. That's the key. That's one of the reasons why we believe it's important to integrate the spiritual into the counseling, is that it is something that helps lead transformation. It's opening to something beyond people that just by virtue of being open to it, it transforms. And you saw that with the woman with the cart. You saw that with the woman and her child who were on the street. You saw that with the neighbor. You saw that with the dog. You saw that with the plant. That at its core, spirituality is always something that transforms us, and therefore it's always something that's deeply active. Thoughts or anything about what I've just said?
Spirituality takes people out of the box of religion.
Yes.
And opens them up to the rest of the world.
Well, and religions are meant to help people open up to that. The problem is that religions over time become functionalized. And what I have a 3-generation theory about religions, if you'd like to hear it. The first generation, this is true of almost any religion, Presbyterians with John Calvin, Lutherans with Martin Luther, going back to the apostles, St. Francis, Teresa of Avila, who was doing more of a reform, whatever.
Yeah.
It is this. The first generation of people have this spiritual experience. It is transforming, and they go, whoa, my life, everything is different. For Francis, he had it while in a dungeon, and he was a really bad soldier in a battle between city-states, and he got captured and spent almost a year in a dungeon. And he had a transforming experience, and afterwards he tried to get back into the regular culture and decided he couldn't, so as his way of demonstrating his transformation, he stripped down naked came before the bishop, basically said, I'm no longer Francis, son of my father, I'm now Francis, son of God, and he walked around naked for a while until they convinced him to put clothing on. And then eventually he got permission to rebuild a little chapel up in the hills, which now has a huge cathedral around it, but in San Damiano, and began to transform. The second generation loves the transformation. They really love the transformation, but they go, there needs to be some order here. We need to get some structure. We need to get something that allows other people to have it. And so they find a way to put structure around these things that allows people to engage in practices and things that open them up to God. The third generation forgets about the experience and they just fall in love with the structure. Where that's what happens is now we're going to sing the same old hymns, we're going to have the same looking sanctuary, we're going to have the same symbols, we're going to do these things. And that's, I think, what happens in religions is over time, they begin to lose a sense of the transcendence, and they functionalize it and turn the functions into the transcendent, which is why I think in a lot of cases people walk away from church because they don't go into churches and feel like they're experiencing that God, the beyond, but they will go to AA and they'll feel like they're experiencing it, even though they have a structure. And sometimes there are people in AA who fall in love with the structure and forget about the higher power that it's supposed to lead to. Does that make sense what I'm saying? And I think that's something to be aware of, because what we're trying to do in therapy is to open people up to that something beyond. But at the same time, use the structures that they're already familiar with, or help them develop structures to have something experiential that opens them up. And it's a tricky dance because you can't just go, well, you just need to leave your church. You've got to quit being Catholic. You've got to quit being Protestant. You've got to become this, become that. You've got to become Methodist. You've got to become something. But instead, it's trying to get a sense of what part of their structures are opening them spiritually. What part of their participation is opening them spiritually? What isn't? Same is true with people who aren't engaged in religions. What is opening you up spiritually? What is not? Can we develop some kind of structure where you're not falling in love with the structure, but what you are doing is you're using some kind of structure that opens you up? So one of the reasons in our, well, for those of you who haven't been part of it, last Friday we did a we do this monthly spiritual integration study that's also available for CEUs with Anchor Point and Samaritan. And it was about remembering that the practices aren't spirituality, although the practices can nurture spirituality. But the moment the practices become the key, we cut the spiritual off. The same thing can be true in our world where we're too quick to move people off their practices, or we're too quick to move them into a practice that we actually are comfortable with, but may not resonate with where they are. So what I want to do before I want to start to talk a little bit about understanding the brain and spirituality, but are there any thoughts or questions before I move on from this? Or comments? So I want to sort of help you kind of understand that spirituality is not disconnected from the brain. And I think this is a problem that sometimes we have a tendency to think of spirituality and the transcendent as something that's just beyond us, but doesn't integrate with us. I think a way of really helping it is to understand the way the brain has developed. As whoever put this together said, reptilian brain, which is sex, feed, hunger, fight, flight, flee, drive-oriented, instinct-oriented, really developed, as it says, 450 million years ago. Our limbic systems began to really develop about 100 million years ago. I think, hopefully most of you are somewhat aware of the limbic system, but the limbic system is the hypothalamus, the amygdala. It's what regulates emotions. It's what regulates our responses to almost everything. And it's really a part, for example, of addictions. Whether it's a process addiction or a substance addiction, all addictions basically get us being driven by our limbic system. Whether it's pornography, which is, appealing to our amygdala and all the rest, or whether it's alcohol, or whether it's drugs, or whatever, that the amygdala system is involved in it, and the more it can dominate, the more it can move us into a more animal existence where our whole life becomes about, I have to get this, I have to get that, I have to get this substance, or I have to engage in this activity. The most the most recent development is the neocortex. The cerebral cortex covering our brain, and especially the prefrontal lobes. I don't know if you think about this, but there's a reason why. Have you ever noticed if you're really trying to think about something and you kind of rub your forehead? Do you know why you're rubbing your forehead? You're massaging your neocortex. You're trying to think really hard, and for whatever reason, massaging your neocortex helps you think. And then every once in a while, you have to rub your whole face. This is something I think as therapists it's important for us to recognize, is that when we are working with a client, we are working with their brains and their bodies. And it's helpful sometimes to just get a sense of where is this person living out. We have a culture that prizes rationality, that believes that people are rational. They aren't. We're basically limbic people with periodic adventures into rationality. If you've ever had an argument with a spouse, if you've ever watched a TV show, anything, they always, we can get caught up in that. And I think one of the problems we're really running into now, and this impacts all of our work, we are living in a time of limbic capitalism. Limbic capitalism is we are living in a culture where almost everything in the culture is geared towards your limbic system. Where do you get your news? You don't have to actually tell me, but where do we get our news? Well, we tend to get the news that fits with our ideology and that actually helps us be outraged about other things from a certain perspective. cable news, radio, all of it is mostly designed to hit our limbic system. If you think about, what kind of cars we drive, what kind of clothes we wear, the foods we like. I mean, if you look at advertisements, you look at marketing, it's all geared towards our limbic systems. When you see a client, quite often they are caught up in a cycle of limbic system. Whether you know it or not, you're dealing with them. When you ask them why they do something, when you ask them, well, why did you do that? What often is their answer? I don't know, because the limbic system doesn't have a language. They're expressing they don't know, because they're not living in the area of rationality, they're living in the area of physical and physiological responsiveness. Part of the whole cognitive behavioral therapy is to get people aware of this. Okay, what was the trigger? What was the emotion you had to the trigger? That's the limbic system. What thought did that generate? How do we make it, and then what behaviors did that spark? What we want to do is to get you explore the emotions and ask the question, are those the appropriate emotions to this trigger? Is there another way of thinking about this? When I say, is there another way of thinking about this, what are you getting the people to do?
Move to the neocortex.
Move to the cortex. And then to try to actually create a system where they're making freer decisions, and the amygdala, the limbic system, is adjusting to our thinking, rather than our thinking adjusting to the limbic system. I mean, Chris, I think about with couples, what makes it really hard is you're working with two limbic systems. And one may be more aware, but one may not, and one may be more ensconced in this, where it almost gets to the reptilian level, where what the other person says feels like a survival threat.
Yeah, it's knee-jerk, knee-jerk.
Yep. Yeah, and at that point, they're really moving more into reptilian, where everything feels like an existential threat. This person is threatening my existence because they're threatening my whole perspective on who I am.
So what I was thinking, what you were saying is, it's really getting people to slow down. The limbic system is the fast.
Yes.
So I say to people, when you go over speed bumps, what should you be doing?
Yeah.
Instead, everyone's speeding over there's conflict.
Yep.
It's too fast. You have to build a pause to be able to think about it.
Or as I like to say, if you're disagreeing with me, that's your limbic system. Just go into your prefrontal cortex. Yeah, but no, that's exactly right. One of the things that when I was at Duquesne that really became something that we became aware of is there is also a transcendent mind. There is a mind that seems to be about transcendence. My wife at one point worked with a guy who she admitted to me years later she had a massive crush on, but she worked with a guy who was a psychologist as part of a program, and he used to say, eventually brain researchers are going to find the religious part of the brain, and they're going to be able to take it out, and then people will be able to live lives that are completely rational. Actually, that's not what brain research has found. Brain research has found other things. When I was at Duquesne, they really emphasized there is another brain that's going on in us, that whenever it developed, it seems to have developed with the development of culture. And it is a transcendent brain, it's a spiritual brain that is very much connected into the world we live in, but also seems to be connected with something beyond. How many of you ever heard of a guy named Eben Alexander? What did Eben Alexander write? Do you remember the name of the book? Because I do.
He had a neurological...
Yeah, he went into a coma.
And he went into a coma, and he had this experience
Yes.
of the afterlife.
He was a neurologist working at the University of Virginia, and he went into a coma for 7 days because of meningitis, viral meningitis. And literally, they mapped his brain for a whole week, and there was nothing, not much brain activity at all. And yet, he had these incredibly rich experiences going on. And after he recovered, I think it was called Proof of Heaven or something like that. But after he recovered, he wrote about it in a book, but he has since been following up with studies on consciousness. And there are a lot of brain researchers and neurologists now and neuroscientists who are studying brain structure to ask the question, and this apparently is in neuroscience has become a big topic. Is the brain all there is? Or is the brain really more a container of a mind that goes beyond the brain? That it's the interface with human life and with life in this existence, but there seems to be a mind beyond. This is, when I was at Duquesne, they often taught there is a mind beyond. There is a transcendent brain that is in touch with things that are beyond us. But it is also integrated with things within us. It's not a separate brain from us. It also interacts with us mentally, physiologically, relationally, emotionally, and everything else. And so what I want to do is I want to kind of give you a little bit of connection with what some of the big brain researchers have done. This is a guy named Mario Beauregard. Denise O'Leary is actually a reporter for the Toronto Star who acted as a co-writer and ghostwriter for this book. It is a really detailed book. But Mario Beauregard is a neuroscientist who teaches at McGill University in Toronto. Before that, he worked at Arizona State University, I believe. Is that University of Arizona? I think it's University of Arizona. He began to do brain studies, and one of the things they found when doing brain studies of people not only praying, singing hymns, reading scripture, engaging in religious activity, is they found there is no spirituality center of the brain, because what?
The whole brain.
It's the whole brain. That's exactly right. That when we engage in spiritual activities, it involves not only the neocortex, it also involves the limbic system, it also involves all the way down to the cerebellum. That what they found when they had to put brain CAT scans on nuns who pray, is that all of a sudden all areas of the brain begin to fire up. That it's not just one specific region, but that it's, and this is going to come into play later on today when I talk about this, but it seems to integrate everything else into it. It's the whole brain that integrates our emotions, it integrates our thinking, it integrates our bodies, even our body regulation. It's one of the reasons why when you teach deep breathing and things like that, but if you connect it spiritually, it actually changes the body. It can calm the body. It not only reduces anxiety, but it can induce states where anxiety is really kind of pushed, where it becomes easier to regulate. So what Mario Beauregard said, spirituality means any experience that is thought to bring the experiencer into contact with the divine. In other words, not just any experience that feels meaningful. Mysticism generally means pursuit of an altered state of consciousness that enables the mystic to become aware of cosmic realities that cannot be grasped during normal states of consciousness. So we're getting into the more technical language of this presentation. But just one or two of you, what comes out to you in what he's saying about spirituality?
One of my professors at Waynesburg said, our mind is greater than our brain.
Yeah, our mind is greater than our brain, which is, I think, what he's talking about. Others?
I get the sense of connection again, of like
Yeah.
beyond just your normal self.
Yeah. That somehow, when you're engaging spiritually, it's a contact with something that you don't understand and beyond. When you're helping a client do that, it is moving therapy out of your control, but it's connecting them with something that's beyond them. I'll take it even, it's also with us as therapists when we connect spiritually. I don't want you to put you on the spot, Carol, because I'll summarize what you said if you remember it, but you talked about this last week in our group. Do you remember what you said? You talked about when you're kind of in a situation and you're not necessarily sure what to do. I think it was you. Maybe it was somebody else. Well, one of the therapists on there said, oh, it was Rachel.
but I don't remember what it said.
It's okay. The unknown therapist said this.
That was you, Rach.
I notice when I'm in a session and I don't know what to do, if I just quietly, and actually, Jennifer, I think you've said this to me in the past too. When I don't know what to do, I kind of pray, and I notice within 2 or 3 minutes, something shifts.
It was Keisha.
Is it you?
Yep.
I'm
Yeah.
so sorry, Keisha. I didn't mean it. Well, okay. But spiritually, it was a collective thought of Rachel, Carol, Jennifer, and Keisha. She just happened to be the one through whom it came through. I am so sorry. You know, it's hard when you have boxes, like you try to figure out, and then the boxes shift. So when we're doing the Zoom.
Great.
Yeah, go ahead, Carla.
You know how in shrink school they taught us to chase the almighty aha moment?
Yeah, chase the almighty aha moment.
And I realized one day that aha moments don't come from chasing, they come from waiting.
Yeah. Carl's comment is, aha moments don't come from chasing, they come from waiting. It's a receptivity. It's an openness to.
That's how that speaks.
Yeah. And remember what I said, beliefs and expectations, excuse me. Beliefs and expectations shape it. If you're not open to any kind of an aha moment, if you're resistant to it, it won't happen. I always think about, we had a member of our church a long time ago, and eventually became our associate pastor. But she came to talk to me early on after joining the church. Her name's Connie, and Connie said, I really want to go spiritually, but I'm really worried that if I do, God's going to call me to go to Calcutta. And I kind of laughed at her, and I said, well, listen, I promise you, if you really don't want to go to Calcutta, it's kind of like Harry Potter's sorting hat. You know, you do have some choice in this. You know, I didn't say that because Harry Potter hadn't come out yet at the time. But there is, if the expectation is, if I'm called, I'm going to have to go to Calcutta, then that's going to close you off. If you're receptive to it, what we always kidded her was you weren't called to Calcutta, you were called to Calvin. Yeah, go ahead, Pat.
When I read that, and based on everything you're saying, I think the word that keeps coming to mind for me is surrendering.
Surrendering, yeah. The spirituality is about surrendering to something kind of beyond.
And I wanted to add with the cosmic realities, for me it's like about revelation, revealing, it's like the aha moments.
Yeah. It is about revelation and revealing. This also from Mario Beauregard says, from a neural perspective, the key finding from study 1, he did this massive study, I'm not going to bother with this, tell you his study was that many brain regions, not just the temporal lobes, are involved in mystical experiences. These include the inferior parietal lobule, visual cortex, the caudate nucleus, and the left brain stem, as well as many others. I know you all were worried about those parts of the brain. Our findings demonstrate that there is no single God spot in the brain located in the temporal lobes. Rather, our objective and subjective data suggest that RSMEs, that's his word for, and I don't remember what they stand for spiritual experiences, are complex and multidimensional and mediated by a number of brain regions normally implicated in perception, cognition, emotion, body representation, and self-consciousness. In other words, what he's saying is their neurological studies are saying that spirituality involves the whole brain and not just particular parts of the brain. I'm going to move to a different researcher. This is Andrew Newberg. Andrew Newberg is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And he's done a tremendous amount of studies on contemplation, what in the Christian language they call contemplation, in Buddhist language they will call meditation. If you contemplate God long enough, something surprising happens in the brain. Neural functioning begins to change. Different circuits become activated, while others become deactivated. New dendrites are formed, new synaptic connections are made, and the brain becomes more sensitive to subtle realms of experience. Perceptions alters, beliefs begin to change, And if God has meaning for you, then God becomes neurologically real. What do you think he's saying in this that has resonance for us as therapists?
He's saying the opposite of what was said in the communist movement. That religion is not the opiate of the masses. In fact, it empowers the masses.
Yeah, that religion, as opposed to Marxist thought, religion is an opiate. Religion actually, you know, in Catherine's language, it reveals. But even more, it causes your brain to grow. You know, there used to be a thought that the brain is formed at a certain age and then nothing new happens. They're now finding that new connections, new dendrites, new neurons, new everything can grow depending on your experiences. And what he's saying is that when we engage in some kind of spiritual activity, the brain actually begins to grow new connections. It actually begins to grow new neurons. It doesn't reduce us, it expands us. Last thought from Angie Newberg. Along with my research staff at the University of Pennsylvania and the Center for Spirituality and the Mind, we are currently studying Sikhs, Sufis, yoga practitioners, and advanced... Did you know who Sufis are? Sufism is that was actually part of my dissertation. I had to trace, my dissertation title was From Individualistic to Communal Spirituality. And I had to dialogue it with my adhere to tradition, which is Presbyterian Christian. I had to dialogue it with science, art, and literature, so I had to do biology, neurology. Neurology back in the 1990s wasn't what it is now. But I also had to dialogue it with a non-adhere to tradition, which I chose Sufi Islam. Sufis, if you've ever heard of whirling dervishes, often they have cloaks that spread out, and they will spin with one hand up and one hand out, and they usually wear fezzes, and they tilt, and the spinning is part of their prayer life, which is very different from Christians who are told to sit down, sit still, and don't move. Yoga practitioners, obviously, they're different because it involves the body in a different way. What you are hearing in this is spiritual practices have a wide variety of ways of using the body. We are currently studying Sikhs, Sufis, yoga practitioners, and advanced mediators to map the neurochemical changes caused by spiritual and religious practices. Our research has led to the following conclusions. Each part of the brain constructs a different perception of God. To me, that's fascinating. Your amygdala does one thing, your prefrontal cortex does another. You know, different parts of the brain understand God differently. Every human brain assembles its perceptions of God in uniquely different ways, thus giving God different qualities and meaning and value. Spiritual practices, even when stripped of religious beliefs, enhance the neural functioning of the brain in ways that improve physical and emotional health. Two ways of thinking about this. It is okay to introduce a practice that may not be tied into religion, and it is okay to introduce a practice to a non-religious person. Alternatively, if you have someone who is stuck in a religious perspective or religious practice that is not working, moving them to some kind of a different practice where you are intentional about opening them up to a different perspective of the brain, that actually has benefit. So for example, I'm working with someone who's referred to me she had a therapist, and this woman was struggling spiritually, and she said, the therapist said, why don't you create this woman has felt kind of abused and disconnected from her church. The therapist suggested she create a spiritual garden in her apartment. Get a bunch of plants. That didn't work for her. Why not? Well, it didn't take into account who she was. She doesn't like growing things inside, right? I mean, so if you're going to start a spirit garden inside your apartment, she's also in a very tiny apartment that doesn't have much room. That also, it's not something that is meaningful. But what we did talk about was Go out, if you like walking your dog, turn that into a spiritual practice. Find somewhere that resonates with you. She's a person who liked to sing. I mean, loved to sing, and that was part of her bad experience. And so one of the things we talked about is go find a venue that's a different place to sing so that you can recapture that experience of God in your singing. Don't disconnect the singing, disconnect the singing from the thing that felt abusive. Reconnect your singing, which she has, and it's changed things. Intense long-term contemplation of God and other spiritual values, like in that video, appears to permanently change the structure of those parts of the brain that control our moods. So as a result, spiritual practices can change our moods and how we interact with the world. They give rise to our conscious notions of self and shape our sensory perceptions of the world. Contemplative practice strengthens a specific neurological circuit that generates peacefulness, social awareness, and compassion for others. Again, one of the struggles of our clients is because of the things they're struggling with, their worlds shrink. Opening up spiritually actually re-engages them with the world. So with these 4 different things, especially the last one, are there thoughts that hit you about spirituality and therapy and the brain? Yeah, Tom.
Integration.
Integration,
Because when you talk about this permanent change in the brain, it's pulling together different parts and making them work together better. And when you use something like internal family systems in your therapy, you're talking about fractured parts, and unburdening parts, and allowing them to then become part of the wise self. So integration is the word for me. I mean, honestly, the longer you engage in prayer and grow spiritually, I think you find less of the sort of dividers in your thinking. You know, the things that have become.
It seems to bring things together. Yeah, it reconnects a lot of different areas, and not in ways that we even understand. You know, I've often said, what I've noticed is, conservatives who become really, really spiritual become more liberal. Liberals who grow spiritually become more conservative. Women who grow spiritually actually integrate more male characteristics. Men who integrate more female attributes. You know, maybe not physiologically, maybe, I don't know. But even beyond that, that as we grow spiritually, it can actually impact our religious perspectives, because what happens if our religious perspective is like this and we begin to open up to other perspectives? You know, one of the problems of at least modern Christianity is this tendency to split everything apart. You know, what happens when you begin to grow spiritually and you want to reconnect, but you have a real hard time finding that place where they reconnect? You know, personally, as a Presbyterian pastor, I run into that all the time. I may be Presbyterian, but I don't think like that. But it's because I've committed my life to spiritual growth. So what do you do when, you know, my wife is Catholic, I have a PhD from a Catholic university, I have studied Islam, Buddhism, you know, I'm in the process right now of reading the Quran. You know, what do we do with all that? You know, do we open up to it or not? Other thoughts about all of these? Yeah, Carla.
If it's true that low serotonin inhibits cognition, we understand that. It inhibits accurate definitions of, or accurate perceptions of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Low serotonin would just be one thing troubling depressed or anxious people. We'll just go with that. So my question would be, would it be too great a leap to make the assumption based on what you said, to say that we could help the patient expand the use of their brain to combat that phenomenon where when I'm depressed and when I'm anxious, my perception of the world is inaccurate. And I always say depression and anxiety tells us lies.
Yeah.
I say that to my patients. Could it allow us to see the world in a more, our world, in a more accurate way? Like, oh no, all is not lost. I do not have to kill myself. I in fact do have something to live for.
Yeah. I think, so the question is, biochemically, can...
That wasn't a good question.
Well, no, because what you're asking is, a lot of times depression can be related to low serotonin.
Yeah.
Can an openness to spirituality change that? I think according to them, yes, it can. But you have to work at the level where the client is, as
Yeah,
opposed
I'm not
to.
gonna stop taking my antidepressants.
Yeah, right, that's
I go to
it.
church, but I will take my antidepressant away to church.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me kind of keep going. So about 5 minutes and we're going to take a break. So a way I was always taught at Duquesne to understand this, now this is rooted more in psychodynamic therapy, but I've always related psychodynamic thoughts of conscious, preconscious, unconscious to basically, limbic system, where consciousness is more the cerebral cortex. According to Jung and Freud, that consciousness is really kind of our awareness of ourself. Like right now, you're living a lot in consciousness. When we take the break, you'll move into other areas of your brain as you get food or drink or whatever you get over there. There's preconscious, which is sort of stuff that we can become aware of if we think about it. The lights being on, the hum of electricity, people shuffling in their seats. That these are things we can become aware of if we're focusing, our own breathing, but that often is below the level. And then there's the unconscious parts, which have to do kind of with the amygdala, the cerebellum, the reptilian system. This is the part that is really difficult for us to know because it's a part that doesn't have language. And that part of at least psychodynamic therapy is trying to move people to understand what's going on at a more unconscious level and maybe try to bring language to that. What von Kamm used to always talk about is there's another level of the brain, which is the transcendent, but it's just not something just coming from outside and within, but it also, the transcendent, works through our thinking, our thoughts, our consciousness. It also works through our preconscious. It also works through our unconscious. That spirituality is actually something that moves through all the levels when it's active. I have a slide here and I have no idea what happened to it. So, oh, I see what it was. Never mind. Give me a second because it doesn't seem to want to respond. So the final thing, which to me is kind of what I've been really trying to move through. And I'm going to try to move through this in 5 minutes, and later on I'll come back to it. One of the things that von Kamm talked about a lot, and this is the guidance towards the spiritual direction way I was taught as a spiritual director at Duquesne, but also a large part of our training for our PhD was integrating spirituality into therapy, and they talked a lot about this as a large part of our understanding of therapy. Basically, what von Kamm said is life is about a constant movement of from through to, or what he would call formation, transformation, reformation, and that it is always ongoing. That at any moment, where we are, right now, your own personality set, your own way of being, your own clothing, everything you're doing, you are coming from a particular current form. It's your from. And whatever form we're in, there's a level of certainty, comfort, stability, and security in it. When somebody comes to you for therapy, they are in a from place. By the way, they may be in an abusive situation. But in that abusive situation, there's still levels of certainty, comfort, stability, and security. If you have a woman who's coming to you who's being abused, and you suggest, why don't you move out? Where would I live? Where would I get money? What would happen to all my credit? He has all my credit cards. He has all of this. That while the abuse seems insecure, at amygdala levels, at reptilian levels, at the animal and reptilian levels, there's a lot more certainty, comfort, stability, and security. I've got a roof over my head, I've got food. If you could just help me figure out how to modulate what I say so that I don't trigger him, then things would be good. But that's the problem, because they're actually in a situation where there needs to be some kind of transformation that leads to reformation. The problem is, When you undergo transformation, you undergo uncertainty, discontinuity, anxiety, confusion, frustration, and always a desire to go back. Being aware of this, that almost anything you're saying to somebody is moving them into a transformative phase. And they will automatically push back against it. It's the reason why you are taught techniques to overcome resistance. If they feel being pushed too fast, too hard, it won't just be resistance, it'll turn into defense mechanisms. Denial, repression, regression, projection, all of that. That part of the struggle is that when you're doing therapy, the art of it is that I have to be with you and build up enough trust with you that you trust me to walk with you through this transformation process. And so I have to do two things. I have to, one, move you forward, and two, I have to help you feel safe. If they don't feel safe and they don't feel a connection, the desire to go back is always going to be there. This is the art of therapy, because we've all had clients who, for some reason, they don't feel safe with us. They don't connect with us. Maybe, I've done this myself. Sometimes it's because I think they're at a different phase and I've pushed them too hard. Sometimes it's because all I've done is listen and I'm not actually moving them forward. There's no aha. They're ready for an aha and there's not there. Or I'm pushing them too hard to an aha, chasing the aha, and it pushes them to go back. What Von Kamm said is that whether it's spiritual direction or therapy, the work is always in the transformation, in the through, and that's where the openness to the spiritual helps. Because when we open people to the spiritual, it's not just us giving them guidance, but hopefully we're opening them up to God or the divine or the holy or the sacred or whatever, giving them guidance also. It's the reason why in spiritually integrated therapy, a good question is, well, what do you feel is right inside? Or where do you feel led to? Or are you hearing anything else other than those voices? If you calm down, are you hearing something that's moving you in a different direction? If we can get through that, we can get to reformation, which becomes a new certainty, new excitement, increased energy, and new ways. Here's a reality from a spiritual perspective. If you're really open spiritually, your whole life is a cycle of from through to, where your new to becomes your next from. And it's from through to where you're always being transformed. If you're a pastor of a church, especially a church that has a lot of chronologically enhanced people who like the way church used to be, you are always confronting people. This is like, if you know your Bible, this is Moses on the mountain, and meanwhile they're all down there going, well, let's go back to Israel, because at least there we had shelter and we had food. So, last thoughts on this. Mindsets go along with this. People who are kind of stuck here, often they're stuck in a survival mindset, and they're really caught up in their limbic reptilian systems. That's the struggle, is when they're in a survival mindset, they will bite almost anybody who tries to help them. Preservation mindset is, I'm a little bit open to moving forward, but I want to preserve what I had. This is the person who wants to make changes in their lives, but not too many. I want to move, I want to get a new job, but I want to make sure it gives me this salary that's equivalent to my old salary. So I no longer want to be an engineer. What I really want to do is a performer on Broadway, but I want to make at least the same salary. And that's the hard thing, is as they're moving in here, if you can get someone from here to here, the preservation mindset is always the struggle of going back. Next is an adaptive mindset. That as people open up spiritually, they develop an adaptive mindset, which is they begin to adapt to, I'm open to new things in this particular instance. I will adapt in this particular instance. Final thing is a growth mindset, and these become the healthiest people, who now become open. I enjoy growth. I enjoy learning. Hopefully that's almost all of you. That, your preservation mindset may have said, I really don't want to go to this workshop today, but hopefully throughout the day, your growth mindset will take over, or at least your adaptive mindset. Basically, the spiritual part is this, that ultimately, as we go through transformation, we go from preservation of self to an openness to God, the divine, the holy. That is what spiritually integrated spirituality does. It is still psychotherapy. Your foundation is still what you have, your LPC or LMFT or LCSW or LSW, and whatever it is, that's still your foundation, but the spiritual integration is to open someone to the other that allows for this kind of transformation to take place. Any last thoughts about any of this? Yeah, Bob.
As I'm thinking through this, it occurs to me that spirituality within a session is a team effort. Mm-hmm. So you and the client together are creating it.
Yes.
And I think this is in reference to what was said earlier, where it appears that something is happening that is guiding me to say a certain thing or to behave in a particular way. And when therapy is working well, or we sense that it's working well, it is usually because there is some sort of transformation taking place that is perhaps a transcendent process. There are techniques that we can use, I think, to cultivate this, like mirroring with a client. And we do this with a lot of trauma clients, and mirroring and EMDR and so on and so forth. But it's a team effort. You're creating it together.
It's you and that person, which is actually the perfect segue to us taking a break so we can move into Susan's part, who's going to actually show us some of those techniques and things like that. But I think that's a lot of what spiritual direction is about. Spiritual direction is training in how do you help people become open to that, whatever it is that will move us through that transformation. Let's take about a 5-minute break. Go ahead.